Dear sisters and brothers, thank you for giving me the chance to speak to you once again today. And I hope this opportunity for us to continue our fellowship with one another may be the first of many. I do not need to tell you that we live in a fast-changing and fast-moving world. This is perhaps especially true for where you live in Pakistan. It is also true because most of you are energetic young people, and quite rightly, you want to spend that energy to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ. With this as the background, I would like to spend a few minutes with you sharing some thoughts from a passage that's been important in shaping my own ministry. The passage is Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 24, and it reads, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night he was alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it." I believe that the narrative parts of our Bibles often expect us to use our imagination. I think that this is true with this story. The previous chapters in Matthew's Gospel tell us that Jesus had been very busy. His ministry must have been incredibly demanding, with the constant requests for teaching and healing. Most recently, he had suffered bereavement in the martyrdom of his cousin John, a death that he must have realized anticipated his own. It does not then take much imagination to believe that Jesus was physically, emotionally, and spiritually worn out. So when we come to the verses we've just shared together, I imagine Jesus finding it difficult to put one foot in front of another as he ascended the mountain. I suspect that at some point he may have laid down under a tree and fallen asleep. Refreshed, I imagine he ascended higher up the hill, and there I think he did several things. Perhaps as the dusk fell and he looked around him over the Galilean hills and the lake below him, he was silent in worship. One old hymn writer says of this occasion that, quote, "He shared with thee the silence of eternity, interpreted by love." Jesus, I am suggesting, knew that fellowship with his Father was often one in which words were unnecessary. They simply enjoyed the sublime blessing of being together. But I suspect the time on the mountain also included conversation. Jesus needed to share with his Father his sense of need, and the Father needed to share with him words of comfort and direction. Jesus had come up the mountain suffering from near burnout, and he was shortly going to have to enter into a storm to help his beleaguered followers, before steadfastly setting his face to fulfill his calling. He needed not only the embrace, but to hear the voice of his Father. Matthew, of course, draws a veil over what took place on the mountain. He simply tells us that Jesus went up to pray. However, it's my view, and I think it has biblical warrant, that prayer includes each of the three things I've just described. On a number of occasions, when I've returned from a time of what is often called retreat, I've been asked about my experience. The assumption has been that I have spent a lot of time talking to God. My response has often been that I had spent a lot of time asleep, but that I had been asleep in my Father's arms. Sisters and brothers, sometimes that is what you and I need. The busyness of ministry can leave us exhausted. Jesus knew the need to regularly find time to sleep in his Father's arms. You may well need to learn this for yourselves. Now, I've been married nearly 46 years, Anne and I still engage in conversation with one another, but as our relationship has developed, we've got to know one another better. This has meant that sometimes instinctively we know what the other one is thinking or needs, and on other occasions we simply enjoy being together without the need for an exchange of words. I've little doubt that Jesus understood this and cherished those occasions when he could simply be with the Father who he had come to know and love and enjoy. For us too, the challenge is to get to know our Father better, and as and when we do, to enjoy those intimate, wordless moments, when simply to be in one another's presence brings mutual delight. And to know such moments, of course, we need to find time for one another, as many a married couple knows. Thirdly, when we speak of prayer, there is conversation with the Father. Jesus understood that his Father loved to spend time talking with him. The Reformed tradition with which you and I espouse has rightly understood that the Bible is the very words of God uttered through his Spirit. It's not that God speaks through the words as if the Bible were a media channel. Rather, the words of the Bible are God's words. He has spoken. So to hear from our Father means that we have to be diligent Bible students and be ready to humbly receive what the Scriptures say. As we do so, we will come to know God more intimately. Indeed, the time may sometimes come when we instinctively know what our Father thinks because we've come to know him in the Bible. But this also brings a challenge. If we're to be in an intimate relationship with our God, we have to give time to prayerfully reflect upon the words of God in the Bible. Time spent with him in this way is never wasted. But if God speaks to us, we're to share with him. For Jesus, this included far more than simply asking him for things, though it included that. It meant sharing his heart, his struggles, his anxiety, his pain, his trials, his hopes, his everything. I believe that in sharing this with you, I've not gone beyond what is implied in the words of our text, which says that Jesus, quote, went up by himself to pray, end quote. Over the years, I have found this both a challenge and liberating. This is because these words have reminded me that the Christian faith is not fundamentally about what I do, but is about the relationship that I have with God. I'm not to measure my success, if I can even use such a word, by my achievements, which are his anyway, but by the deepening person-to-person intimacy I enjoy with the triune God. My deepest hope for you all is that you yourselves will long above all to know him. To achieve this intimacy is, of course, not an overnight achievement. It will involve for you, as it does for me, time set aside to get to know God in the Bible. It will include times that we set aside to specially meet with him. Without being legalistic, I try to have daily, monthly and annual spaces where this is possible. I have discovered that this is never a time that I have wasted. For me, as also I think for Jesus, these times apart can be the occasion for renewing our batteries. We cannot keep giving out without taking rest, and we cannot hear from our Father if we never devote time to listening to him. And we will never get to know him well if we're too busy to cultivate our relationship with him. But I've said enough. I conclude, therefore, by referring you to one of the great desert fathers, Antony of Egypt. Antony lived to be 105. It is said that he spent the first 50 years of his adult life mostly alone, getting to know God better. He then spent about 10 years in active ministry before retiring, and for the last 25 years of his life, living in solitude, preparing for his nearer encounter with God upon his death. I'm not suggesting that we are expected to follow Anthony's own practice. However, Anthony had grasped, as we all need to, that we are called to a life of prayer, as we've understood it here, and only out of that life can we be really useful to others, as Anthony was. So, sisters and brothers, spend yourself for Jesus, but never forget the one thing that is needed above everything else, the need to pursue him and abide with him in the mutual exchange of delighted, loving fellowship. It is, after all, from this intimacy with him that your usefulness for him will grow.